Hi, my name is Michael Chanak Jr. That's the legal name. I am originally from Massillon, Ohio, a Northeast Ohio football town. A little tale about my hometown of Massillon. When babies are born in Massillon, they have a big thing about gender. The boys get a football and the girls get a puppet. And I've always believed that mine was switched up a bit, so I kind of lived in that shadow my whole life. But the name Mother Goose or Mother came about because I'm 73 years old, and I guess because I've been around a long time and I kind of have sort of a maternal quality to me, or I'm a nag, one of those. People called me Mother, and then a friend of mine said, "Oh, you're an old eccentric," and his name was John Fry, and John said, "You're Mother Goose, that's who you are." So it just kind of stuck, and I've been with Goose ever since. We just shortened it to Goose, it was easier. Besides, there are too many gay Michaels in this world, just too many. You ever go to a meeting and somebody says, "Michael, Mike, I'm from the era of Michaels and Davids and Larrys and that kind of stuff. When it comes to pronouns, I've never used them. I certainly believe in respecting how other people identify themselves, but for myself, I guess because I was a little non-binary, a little fluid, I really didn't care. I was just a homosexual and I was going to be who I was. It doesn't mean anything to me, but I have friends that I address according to whatever they want to be, acknowledged or honored in a certain way, because I think it's a matter of respect. But for me, everyone just calls me Goose, so it's easy. I got here in 1978. I had a job transfer from up along Cleveland way. I was in the insurance field then, and so I was transferred down here, and that's how I got here. And I've been here ever since, except for 2 years when I went back home to help with my late mom and, her passing to the next realm. Right now I'm in Mount Healthy. I'm living in Mount Healthy. I've lived all around Mount Healthy, though. I've been in Walnut Hills and Beachmont and all that, and mostly in the east or in north central areas of, the metropolitan area. Actually, my journey of discovering who I was, I think I knew when I was 14 years old. I had an aunt who was actually what were they called in World War II, WACs and WAVs. I think WACs were Army and WAVs were Navy nurses. So she was a WAC, so she was an Army nurse. Ooh, she was a bit of a bull, you know what I mean? Kind of, she's probably more masculine than I ever hoped to be. And we were in the car one day with my mom, and she says to me, "Michael," this is Aunt Jane, God rest her soul, "Michael, do you know what a homosexual is?" Just like that. And my mom is, yeah. And I'm like, And I think she tagged me, when I was that young. And, I remember having various things about guys when I was in high school. And I was rather scandalous because I actually did have an affair in high school with somebody. My sister, who's 5 years younger, they were still talking about it 5 years after I was out of that school. So I always felt bad that my whoredom caught her and gave her a rap. But fond memories. But I identified, it was just that I didn't have a way of expressing it. I went to the bars and stuff up in Northeast Ohio. It wasn't like I wasn't going to bars or I didn't have gay friends. My divide was my mom knew because she got a call in when I was in college. I was in a debate society called the Polynesians, and this crazy Jewish lady by the name of Zelda calls up my mom and says, "I'm concerned about this relationship that your son has with David, who is also a gay friend of mine, has." So that began all of it, you know what I mean. So they knew, but the thing was, it's one thing in those days to go to the bars, but the notion of being out to the general public, oh no. Or at work, oh heavens no. It was dangerous. Maybe you wouldn't be fired, but they'd find a way to fire you in those days if you didn't fit. So, no. So it wasn't until I was about 35. I know it sounds like, oh my God, you were that old before you were totally out. But I mean in the sense of being out at work, which happened like in 86. I snuck into Pride in 85. And the reason I was kind of that way is I was working for Proctor Gamble after 85, and I snuck in there and didn't get found out. But in 86, when I went, I got caught by WCPO kissing the late Dr. Bob McNee. And Bob was a well-known geography prof at UC. He was a former chair there. He's passed now. And CPO must have been having a really slow night or slow weekend because the darn thing was on Saturday night. Pride, the other thing I was going to say, Pride was on Sundays in those days. So, days of Pride have moved a little bit. But anyway, it was on 3 days in a row. And I remember coming into work on a Monday and folks, by and large, are really positive considering where I was at and the time frame. But the message was, Michael, we think this is great, and good for you, but you're going to really have to be careful in this work environment. And boy, how right they were.
When did you start at Proctor Gamble?
In 1985, April.
What was your position?
I was just in the old-fashioned word. Those days were technician. I was a research associate, I guess, or whatever. I was just a first-line level person. I was an hourly employee. And so I never made it to management. Oh, heavens no. Heavens no. It was, boy, my workplace after I came out, beyond the initial acceptance by co-workers and stuff like that, I'm not going to tell you there weren't other gay people at Proctor at the time. Of course there were, but they were closeted. It wasn't the era where you had visible role models in the workplace. There wasn't a policy to protect it, or people didn't have an organization that had their back. And anything you heard then, yes, they were talking about diversity all those years ago, but it was directed at by POC in those days, or the beginnings of Latinx, that sort of thing, the Hispanic community, but not in the realm of sexual orientation, and certainly not gender identity. Oh, heavens no. So there really wasn't anything there. I surprisingly, and maybe it was just, maybe we were all using each other, maybe it was the luck of the draw, but 6 months after being in the Pride Parade, I was transferred to a project that was related to a drug product by the name of Paradex that had been released for use. It was a prescription mouth rinse. It was approved by the FDA in '86, and they were marketing it to dentists for gingivitis, but P&G, through their marketing prowess, had figured out that it had an effect on one of the common complications, side effects of HIV, which are oral conditions. You might know it as a yeast infection in the mouth or a thrush. The technical name is oral candidiasis. And they had actually figured that out by looking at where the product was being used and prescribed. And then they realized it was in major metropolitan areas. And as they dug into that, they realized who was using the product. It was gay men, because there were no effective anodynes then for HIV. We don't still have a cure. God forbid we get a cure. But in those days, if you're facing an obvious death sentence and you can't eat because of the oral conditions, you're going to slide even, quicker. So it turned out it was kind of an interesting win-win in a way, because I got to use my connections in the community, and I knew lots of people in the HIV community then, as any gay man would, saw a lot of death, and I knew people in the HIV service organizations and stuff, and so in a way, I used that as perhaps they used me. I used it as a forum to present, hey, you've got a community out here that you're surreptitiously or under the, kind of selling off label to, which isn't illegal. It's, dentist can do that, a doctor can do that. But these people are making you money, and you aren't really doing anything to claim them or to bring them into the fold. And at the same time, they had no clue. Call it insider's information. There's a certain perspective you gather from being in the community versus being outside. And, we're kind of sensitive to who speaks for us and about us sometimes. And who did they have? Who was going to do it? So there I was. So that was kind of the basis of, I started bringing up this stuff about, what are you going to do about this? There's no anti-discrimination policy. We're not in the, company's, inclusion policy, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So that kind of began my struggle. But again, if it were not for Pride and going to Pride, this is why Pride is important, right? It's a place where, yes, it's the most visible portion or anybody sees in our community all year long. And then you jump to HRC dinner or maybe to a P&G Gable function, their affinity group. But Pride is the most visible thing. And it's a way for people, and why Pride is important is because there's a lot of people, that's their coming out. They've never been to a Pride event. It's a big deal. It's a party for some. It's reminiscence for those of us who are older, to see people you might not see because we maybe aren't as mobile, as we were once upon a time, that sort of thing. But it was through Pride that you meet people, and it's through people that you get done. And yeah, sometimes it's rough, and sometimes you don't get along very well, but you do the best you can, right? It's a community, and you have to accept that. And I'm a lot more mellow now, I'll tell you that. But yeah, Pride.
Mellow?
Yeah, I don't. People say I'm mellow. Compared those who knew me years ago, yeah. Yeah, definitely more mellow. But yeah, it's important. And I'm not a person that criticizes Pride a lot. What's the point? Pride is who runs it, and Pride is who attends, and it's who participates. And if you don't like something, then get involved, or, do something, join a group, whatever. But do something, it's too easy to criticize. I know about how to criticize, and I also know what it is to be criticized. So, I got it. I got it. Oh my, when I got here, the sense I had about Cincinnati is it was a beautiful place, compared to where I was. I came from Northeast Ohio. Cincinnati is a beautiful town, but I must say I found people here very closed off. And maybe I'm talking about the gay community, but it did kind of seem very Germanic then. The population of Cincinnati has shifted a lot over the half century. But it did feel very cliquish, and there was very much a sense of you're either from here or people talk about where they went to school, and that's like the only thing. Even in the gay community, it felt like that. I was an outsider, and, I can't say I felt particularly welcomed. Being how I am, I kind of clawed myself in. And I met my first gay person by going to the Golden Lions, now closed on Ludlow Avenue. Who was there but the legendary Peaches Laverne, who is functioning as hostess. And she says, "Oh, you're new here. What's your name?" What a wonderful act of hospitality and sisterhood, if you will. And I explained who I was and where I'd come from, and she took a personal interest in people. You don't see that so much anymore. And she says, "Well, you're cute too." So she had me from that point on. We were friends until she passed in 2004. So she was great. Yeah, Peaches was a trip. But in general, no, I think it was very cliquish. And also I had a foreign-sounding last name. And it was very Germanic. And another thing I would get asked for about a lot in those days, and I haven't had this in years now, so I'm sure it's shifted. I would get, and I never exactly got this because maybe it's because I'm very ethnic and, have certain ethnic features. I would get asked, "Oh, you must be Jewish." And I never understood why. Or "You're Italian." And I said, "No, I'm 100% Greek. I guess close enough." But, it was just odd how people felt very comfortable in that era to ask you about your ethnicity or your background without, just face, based on external characteristics. And I don't sense that as much now. People are more evolved, It does feel that way. It's part of the time. My reflections of the community, the non-gay community, I wouldn't say it was a very friendly place because, there were incidents, and a lot of this involved policing and involved some of the ballot stuff. Well, I'm thinking of There was the Mapplethorpe issue. That was like, what, 1990 when Mapplethorpe, there was an exhibition that came to town. I think it was called the XYZ Expedition, and part of it wasn't available to the public. You had to be screened, but still somehow that ran afoul. And the contemporary arts person ended up, was indicted for something, and then eventually they won. But it's like, oh my God, that kind of crazy stuff. And another thing was there was a guy, and the name will escape me, but he had HIV and was accused of spitting on an officer, and he was prosecuted for, what was it, potential murder or some sort of, dangerous instrumentality, and eventually all that but it's just that kind of crap. And then, add in the whole mess with issue 3 in 1993 and how we lost that vote. And then we kind of went into the medieval ages, the dark ages in Cincinnati till it was repealed in 2004. That's not an indication of a lot of tolerance or acceptance. And in fact, if folks are, people hear me carry on, well, it may be the 50th anniversary, but was it consecutive? The answer is no. There isn't consecutive because, well, first of all, between the first Pride in 73, April 73, and 78, there goes a series of years. And then after 1995, because of the passage of issue 3, honestly, a lot of activists left the area. I knew a lot of them. They left. There was a sense of, we'll win this thing in the courts or whatever. Well, it really didn't happen that way. And so, Pride, there were Pride events, but there were no, there wasn't a formal parade or any of that. And even in those days, we didn't even have cars in the parade till 2000, right? I mean, people forget it's not so long ago, there weren't even, vehicles in a parade here. So that's only, 20, 23 years. It's not ancient history. But yeah, crazy. I was very lucky. And maybe it's how gay society has shifted. But when I came up in the gay community, we had like these older people like aunties. And they kind of brought the younger people along and had nothing to do with the modern notion of grooming or this or that. These were often just non-sexual, like mentoring relationships. Peaches certainly would have been one of mine, and so another one for me was the late Baron Wilson. He was an educator. He and others like him would bring up things from the past. And there was another lesbian, old lesbian by the name of Winnie Bacon. And her real name was Winsome, but she went by Winnie. And she was a school teacher, as was Baron. And both of them would tell me about the old days from the 20s and 30s about, there was a rule, according to Peaches, where if you were out in the street, you had to be dressed you had to have at least 3 items of your correct gender assigned, if you were, a drag queen, you still had to have trousers or a tie or something that identified you, 3 articles of clothing, not to be harassed by the police. And Winnie had told me about these old lesbian softball games that I don't know that they were billed as lesbian softball games in the 20s and 30s, but apparently there was even corporate sponsorship, but they were all women, hello, hello. Where did those go? Why don't we have lesbian softball? Or, there used to be volleyball down at the dock before it closed and things like that. Where did those kind of things go? Sometimes I miss those things or the notions of them. Yeah. I think it always was, and I hate to say, my recollection, I'll say a lot of white gay men, to be absolutely honest about it. I knew certainly some black men and some black women like Marie Dennis or Ron Clemens, who was a black guy, still with us, thank God. Marie's passed along. She was actually a nun. But there were not a lot of people of color that were willing to be involved, and certainly were not a lot of women. And, plus the era of the 70s, I got here in 78, there was kind of the old sense of there was a feminism that developed, and of course the women's movement, and you know, you even look at the roots of the OLA, it was really originally what, the lesbian, LAB, Lesbian Activist Bureau, right? Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, I don't want to say they were separatists, but yeah, in a way they were, because, you know, there was the Crazy Ladies bookstore, and that's all kind of modified. You don't really sense any of that these days. People don't think that way. So there's change, but I know a lot of people, a lot of diverse people, but from that era, I would say there were few to any blacks, and certainly always less women, always. I don't know if it's intrinsic to how the communities are organized, or I knew there was a black bar downtown, which I'm sure someone else can tell you about better than I can. So, you know, hey. In the community of gay people, were there spaces in the, you know, late 70s, 80s, 90s? Sure. I remember, well, we still, you know, it's always been the standing joke of you want to have a meeting, go to a church, right? And of course, even that's shifted a little bit now because people are more aware that some people feel very strongly in the community that the church has not been our friend and they do not want to hold events, and you know, have to respect that. So there's a little more sensitivity around that. But there were places like off the avenue. That was, trying to think, Maureen Wood in Northside. She's passed on, but she was kind of a force in Northside. There was, of course, the Crazy Ladies that was at a couple different locations in Northside, and then was part of the Women's Center in Northside, which is right at the corner of Hamilton and Vandalia there. And of course, that's gone, you know, bookstore business and that sort of thing, kind of a thing of the past. Other spaces. Beyond churches, I can't think of any now because Lord knows we've met in a lot of basements and a lot of churches over the years. Yeah, I actually that's another way I got my start in things. I got my start in things because I went to a Metropolitan Community Church social in September '78. I got here in April. I went to the social along with going to Golden Lions. And at the social, I got hooked up to MCC, and they used to meet Sunday evenings at Church of Our Savior, 65 East Hollister Street in Mount Auburn. And the congregation there was a lot of UC people. It was a lot of the political types from UC, the gay profs and stuff, activist types. And believe it or not, back in those days, they were getting 150 people on a Sunday night. So, you know, yes, there were places, but you had to know about them. And I was really lucky to meet those people because I don't want to say they radicalized me, but they were, again, my basis of support. You know, again, a lot of them were older, you know, Bob McNee, Larry Wolf, you know, gosh. And then so many of these people also passed on of AIDS. So there's a lot of reasons we're in the space we're in today. You know, a lot of our history was lost because of HIV. Really a whole generation, and sad. And, you know, because of how things were then, you know, that's what my friend Bishop John Bell says, you know, you realize, Michael, how many gay guys died alone or without their families, and their stuff was just tossed out. And, you know, all those records and stuff, oh, gosh, yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, I guess I don't know why this is, but my family had something to do with the starting of the Greek Orthodox Church in Northeast Ohio. So I was someone who had my arguments with religion, but for some reason I was drawn to it at the same time. And that was maybe the basis of my association with New Spirit Metropolitan Community Church. Also the Episcopal Church, Church of Our Savior. At the time, Christ Church Cathedral came along a little later as being known as gay friendly, or the Unitarian Church in Clifton, of course, St. John's. I think it's St. John Unitarian. And they were around, but it's not in any way the huge list that it is now. Somewhere along the line, and I would say the late 1990s, 2000s, these churches figured out you got these huge sandstone art, you know, edifices in the urban area. What is the best way, you know, who's got money, who's going to come? You know, big congregations at Clifton United Methodist, you know, all these churches. Yeah, there were churches, all right. And there were bars. Lord knows there were bars. I did definitely, I liked Golden Lions. I'm old enough to remember the Badlands. That was fun. And of course, the opening of the dock. And my favorite, which is now closed because it's actually where, the 21C is across from the Aronoff. That used to be in the basement, the old Subway. We called it the Subway Bar and Grill. And hustlers would hang out in front. And that's where Peaches, she was a hostess there for a while as well. And, I did the gay radio show Alternating Currents for 10 years from 86 to 96. And, this is the era where they were opening Aronoff, but the Subway was still there across the street. We used to make fake ads up when we say, the Subway Bar and Grill, conveniently located across from the Aronoff Center. It's just like this juxtaposition of two different really, the sleaze and the highbrow. And that's Cincinnati, right? Cincinnati, I'm going to tell you, Cincinnati is a place that is full of dirt and full of tales. And it seems sometimes on the surface a little layer of propriety, less so now. But boy, is the gossip and the stuff here is something else. And I love it. It kept me alive this long. I love it. I got my hands dirty sometimes. Oh, yeah. People didn't always like that trait in me, but boy, there's nothing more curious than people and the stories they tell. And I'm sort of an organizational, I don't want to say troll, but I just watch these characters carry on now, and I just love it. I love it. There's a lot of positioning now, a lot of ego. They tell me that the advent of social media was to democratize communities, right? Wasn't that the notion? It seems to me all it's done, including Michael Chanak, has given a bunch of tin gods a chance to off-gas and lecture other people. And get off my page if you don't. Oh, please. I'm very much a believer. When people say they're involved because they post, I used to say, what? Until they turn out and they show a little, sweat between their tatas, I ain't going to believe it. And I'm still that way. Whatever happened to, actual... Is participating in the community now going to listen to somebody with credentials lecture you? Whatever happened to participation? Anything that I've gone to in modern era from community centers on has been like someone wants to set themselves up and tell you how it is. I'm sitting there saying, now, gee, I sat at a community center 10 years. I know the history of this. Don't ask me anything. Don't let me talk, right? It's very much that, we're in charge type of stuff here, this hierarchy. I hate it. And you just have to be a cat like I am sometimes to, bring it out and say it. I've emptied a few rooms. Yeah, I have. Oh, yeah. One of these community center meetings of recent design, I brought up, they had done a survey. It was not a scientifically constructed survey. I'm not going to pretend I'm a PhD in math, but I did work in consumer research at Proctor Gamble. And as I looked at the survey, I could tell that it had been skewed. It was very obvious that they were interested only in young people or trans people. And the meeting begins with the facilitator, if you will, saying, well, here's our website. And this is and I'm thinking, wait a second, this is a meeting that was billed as community input, not for you to be up there lecturing us about your website. This is not a tour of the Mediterranean. We don't want to know about your accommodations today. So, of course, somewhere in this meeting, Michael had to act out, and I said, well, heavens to Betsy, I heard an offhanded comment, well, we're not getting the results, referring to the survey. We're not getting the results that we wanted. And I'm like, so what you're saying is you have intentionally designed an instrument to present to the community that is skewed. One of them blew up and the other one sprayed me. Oh my God, by spraying I mean just hosed me down, and I just held my ground and we had it out, and afterwards, boy, that room was like a tomb. But screw it. This is a community, and this isn't about anointing people gods. We need to have stuff that works and is accessible to ordinary people. I know people say, well, this isn't Chicago. Well, no, I'm not saying it has to be Chicago, but don't pretend it is either. Find, in public speaking and in organizations, you have to assess your audience. What is it that people want? a survey isn't a bad idea, but it's not the only way to know. Because, even surveys, it skews to, well, these days, are you going to get the older demographic? They're not all that hooked up to the internet. My generation isn't. I'm an exception to that, of course, but, you got to look at the methodology and how you're interfacing with people. It's not just one shoe. They just want to throw things out there now and hey, it's going to work for everybody. No, doesn't work that way. So that's enough of Michael lecturing on how things ought to be. Sure, that was an offspring of the Gay and Lesbian Community Center that ended up in Northside, its last part of its life, closing in 2013, November. Started as a project of the old Gay and Lesbian Community Center. So here's a little history lesson. The first Pride was put on by the gay community, I think it was just called the Gay Community of Cincinnati, and it dissolved quickly after '73. The Gay and Lesbian, the Gay Coalition, which is what it was called, I believe started in '78, and then it became the Gay and Lesbian Coalition, and finally incorporated in 1984 as a nonprofit. But it was the central clearinghouse for organizations. So that existed from '78 through, let's see, about 1994. And the center kind of was an offshoot of that because one of the standing committees was to start a community center. And Jeff Bixby, who's now in Northeast Ohio, Joe Benavides were on the committee that John Maddox started for that topic. And eventually the center did open downtown on Longworth Hall informally in the fall of '93. And officially, I think, January of '94. And they were there for about a year and a half. And then, getting support for it was difficult. They were in the old education building, and eventually that didn't go so well. And, thanks to Scott Knox, the organization was able to be moved up to Northside in 2000, where it stayed another 13 years. So that's quite of a chunk of history in a few words, yeah. Seen it all, said most of it. Why didn't it last? Not for trying, not for trying. I felt I didn't have much to do with it when it initially formed because I felt like it was absurd, the level of, the board was one of these things where there's a two-tiered board, there were the executives and then there was community board members. And I just thought, what's wrong with these people? They're trying to create how many angels can fit on a head of a pin. It was just like all too corporate for me. I'm not, even though I worked in a corporation, I'm like, I want things to work. I don't want to have all these complexities. I think it was to maintain power and to maintain control, which is what gay people turn around and do to each other. We haven't learned yet. We reenact crap that we learned from the broader society, and so we get a little bit of power and we get crazy. We create these messes. So why did it die? I think there was a sense that I can't say that they didn't try their best. They were involved in Pride. They started, they had Kings Island. They were getting the money off of Kings Island to stay open. I think it just got to the point where it was not a clear enough focus. People say community center, and immediately you say community center and I think of job assistance, legal aid, programs, to hang out, to meet the pretty people, and on it goes. Well, that's a lot when you're starting out. And I think that there's a tendency to scope creep. I think that people really need to be very narrow in their focus and start small. But they don't. They immediately jump to ribbon cutting and egos and their names on plaques. And that's why these things don't succeed. You need people to turn out and help. You don't need, who's going to be wanting to be interested in something if all you're going to do is lecture them and treat them like the household help? That's what tends to go on. That's my opinion about it. So, stuff I ran was successful. So that's all I'm going to say. It opened on Longworth Hall, the fall of 93, was there in 94, and I think they left out of there in 95, which was downtown on what is 2nd Street, Pete Rose Way. Then they were in the old education building, and that's downtown, and I'm trying to think what street that is, I don't remember. And then by 2000, we were across from Chameleons, or right next to the Hoffner Park in Northside. And that's where they were the last 13 years. So at least 3 moves for them. Yeah. Why did it fail? I think that the community center eventually failed because it was, even in spite of trying every program, we had stuff on death and dying, we had, trans stuff, Trans 101 that Jack Stringer used to teach. We even retried, having the coalition meetings. It just seemed that the only reason people were coming there was to use the computers because they weren't tied up like they were at the public library, just a few blocks up. People come in there, look at the computer screens, and it's 4 or 5 computers in the day, and that was it. We just didn't think it was enough of a reason to continue to expend the money. And, it wasn't the most expensive operation, but it's probably $15,000 a year. And yeah, we had money, but isn't a center to be a little more vital than that? It just didn't, we could have gone on and it'd probably be the same 10 people there all month long, if that's what you want. Where did anybody go after all these organizations died? Yeah, that's a good question. Where did people go? I don't know. I think we were suffering from the fact that not only were there unmet expectations, there were unrealistic expectations put on us. Then you have the problem of, look, the gay community is full of shrinks and social workers. And what we found is that they would send, social workers would say, people would come in and understandably, what would a social worker say? Well, you need to get involved with people. Well, where should you go? Maybe they have a substance problem. You're going to send them to the bar. You're going to send them to the center, right? Well, you ended up with a goodly number of people that really had emotional problems we just weren't equipped to deal with. I'm not saying they didn't have a right to be there, but we had some very, serious issues that we had to deal with, frank mental illness. So it can be very difficult in a group setting when you have someone who's talking themselves or threatening people, and it's not for the faint of heart. To me, that's more like the real world, Yeah. And there, there's another thing with people is that then they'll complain about the neighborhood, and then they were saying, well, Northlight isn't safe, and well, what is safe, and where does individual responsibility, you don't want to, if you're concerned about that, then go with a friend or make some sort of accommodation. There's nothing going to be perfect. It's difficult. And then we had problems with accessibility. While the inside of the building was accessible, there were 3 stairs up to the building, and that's because it was, it was grandfathered in because of, it's a historic area, and you couldn't change that. It wasn't as though we weren't strong enough to lift somebody's chair up or the chair wouldn't fit in, but then people say, you're not handicapped. Just endless. Everything's a compromise, and no one wants to compromise. That's interesting. When I first got here, Northside in the late 70s and 80s was a pit. I mean, it was horrific. It was like junior OTR. I remember the street lamps were like these fluorescent things that were at angles. It was horrible. And then, in the early 80s, there was a realtor who was also an MCC pastor, Howard Goss, that started to try to sell property, in Northside to kind of begin that transition to a gayborhood. And what success he had, I don't know, but it became, with the women there, and, that was one of the things, it was called Dykeside, remember that? And there was a while, there were some bars there. What was it, Jacobs? And then, what was the other one down from there? It always had trouble, Oh, God. There was this Serpent. We called it the Slurpant. That was a men's bar. That's where the Tilly's is today. there was a lot of stuff there. It was certainly a little more organic then. Now it's gotten a bit more gentrified. It's too pricey. If you look and see, of course, everything's too pricey now, but Northside was kind of working class Appalachian. It had a kind of comfy home feeling to it, but I don't know. You've got, the old can factory's been converted to, fancy apartments and all that. But that one block between Vandalia and 5 Points, I guess it's called, or whatever it is, where the White Castle is, still sort of like it was. They've never really managed to completely urbanize that or gentrify it. Still kind of broken down looking. Yeah, that's the name. Yeah, Knowlton's Corner. Yeah, that area is not, the faces of the building have changed a little bit, but, that's the location of the old MCC, and now it's a bike shop. It's just different things that come in. There was another bar. There was actually 2 bars in that strip for a while. I can't remember the other, but yeah. 2 gay bars. Yeah, well, and then they put that, John Arthur, so-called low-income housing up in Northside. And not to be controversial, but that's not HUD housing, Not every suite there is subsidized by the government, right? In HUD housing, it's like 30% of your income. Well, not all that's under some sort of tax abatement program, not HUD. And so that's been kind of one of those little Northside controversies. People thinking, I don't know how many units are in that, but they all think all of them are low income. They're not. And so, there's a housing need. Northside, I'm sure it's impacting all of us in the community. So, yeah. Because not everybody can afford to live in these so-called gayborhoods. It does tend to be on an island somewhere, getting older in the gay community. I mean, it works a couple of ways. First of all, as you get older, you got some stupid medical thing or something that slows you down, or things aren't as accessible. You take Pride, for instance. I love Pride, but, I have 2 knee replacements. There are other parts that have been replaced as well. We won't go into that, but the whole point is it's not the most easy to navigate. So old people tend to, stay away sometimes, or it's, awfully hot that time of year. And you tell me what person that's over 50 isn't on some sort of blood pressure medication that's going to be zoned out in the heat because their blood pressure bottoms out, Yeah, I was almost hauled off of Fountain Square in 2010, from heat stroke. Yeah, it was hilarious. I wouldn't let them take me. Where are queer elders now? Well, I think they're just here and there. I don't know that there's a pocket. As I look at my friendship group, here locally, anywhere from Pleasant Ridge to the west side to up to Mason beyond, some have moved closer to maybe their roots, I think is part of it sometimes. But there isn't really a strong center where I would say, that's a place to see olders. No, I don't think there is one in Cincinnati. Yeah, I wasn't, as far as the gay bars, I wasn't much of a bar queen. I mean, there's nothing wrong with the bars, but I just needed more of my friends were kind of the political type, so I would be like mired up in going to different actions and stuff when we used to have them. The last I really knew of what I would consider a halfway gay-related action was in 2014, there was a marriage event on Fountain Square. But since then, all that's kind of died off. You ever notice as we have relied more on groups to represent our interests that less seems to get done? Just an observation. I'm not saying they aren't involved in something, but I don't think the average person has a sense of what organizations that portray themselves as representing our interests on a national basis. Most people just don't know what they're doing, and maybe that's a problem. My first Pride as far as attending was 85, and that's where, that time in my life, I was working at P&G, and I didn't really want to be seen. But it was in 76 that I went down there and was discovered by CPO, and that's how I got out at P&G, and that put into play a whole bunch of other things. But my involvement with Pride really began then, and it went on for a good 30 years. I was either doing publicity for Pride, I was a coalition officer. I also did the gay radio show that supported, alternating currents that, of course, supported Pride, as did the gay cable show. I was on towards the end of Gay Cable Network and then out front Gay Lesbian TV, so a lot of that involved Pride. So I had a lot of connections to Pride. Pride is one of those things that touches a lot of people's lives, and everybody will say, oh, this happened and this happened and that happened. And, let me tell you what I've learned about history. I'm not really a historian, I'm an observer. First Pride was in 73, and I wasn't here. I didn't get here till 5 years later. And as I started poking into Cincinnati's gay pride history, which is how I got mired up in the history of some things, I started asking people about that first Pride. And I'll tell you, it humbles you. You think you know history? You never know history. Not really. Each person has an implicit bias. They bring with them their experiences, their recollections. They get vague. They fade away. The friendships aren't everybody else's friendships, everybody else's experience. So it's possible that a group of people could go to something and have a very different experience. And I look back until I actually found, wasn't there a publication called The Eye? It was an independent newspaper, yeah, where I finally found the article about the 73 Pride. I had people trying to tell me that, 200 people were there. Oh, no, it was 30 white men. Oh, you should have heard the stories that were told. And I talked to probably 100 people until I saw the article where I began to realize, you got to really be careful with this stuff, because it's fascinating. In fact, there was such a bad story written up about it that I actually called somebody in task, and they were running with the story that it was white men. And I thought, oh, honey, look at the photo. Even now you can tell it wasn't, 50 white men. Oh, God, where does this stuff come from? Yeah, and that's the thing. I was very lucky in a sense that I got to participate in all these things in Cincinnati, and I was stubborn enough to participate in these things, and I didn't get run off, and much to the chagrin of some, I suppose. And then here I was late in life, and I was turned into a mini Hollywood star thanks to Proctor and their diversity flicks and the history of Gable and all that. And yet I realized that there are many stories that are never going to be told. I was just one of the lucky ones. What were the chances that my work at Procter & Gamble would somehow become subject of a CNN, video that's seen the world over, translated into 13 languages? Yeah, that's not going to, I'm just a small town kid. This happened in Cincinnati. But I also know at the same time, I'm humble enough to realize that there are contributions out there that don't reach the light of day. And I know that. I know that. And that's why in my walk as an older person, and particularly since this stuff with Proctor went on, I have advocated to see that, individuals that I felt at least were never acknowledged get acknowledged. I don't think we do enough advocacy for other people in our community because we're too worried about our own CV. And I think some of my worst critics or my closest friends will tell you that, yeah, Chanak's tried to, to get some people, recognized. I think it's important because it is part of our history. Who's a wonderful dirt queen? Believe it or not, one of the people that carries a lot of tales, you've talked to Ron, and certainly that's important. You've probably haven't talked to Giggles yet. That's Dr. Maddox. That's my nickname for him.
Oh, yeah. We're in touch. And we need to
yeah, that would be good because he remembers that. Another one, now I know these are white men, God forbid, but that's all we had then. You're going to talk to Phoebe or have. Of course, she'd be important, and she might, and I think she was going to hook you up with Sequoia. Yep, exactly. The one who knows a lot of those old stories, and he kind of focuses on this, is John Bell, Bishop John Bell.
Yeah, I want to talk to
I would definitely talk to him because he knew Barron, and he and Barron were, in a way, Barron was John's auntie. Mm-hmm. And he's got 1,001 of those old stories. my mind's a mush now. I mean, I've just, it's hard to be a journalist, a petty star, and being involved in all these things and a halfway activist and still keep anything sane or straight upstairs. So, yeah. One thing we did that it's seldom mentioned about Pride history is actually in the late 90s when there weren't Pride parades, there were a couple of festivals, call them that, and what's that playground? What's it called? The Washington Playfield out there in Mount Washington, which is Lunken Playfield, all in that area. Yeah, where the airport is. Well, before there were the modern type of communications, we still were doing alternating currents. And what we do, long before Cheryl announced it from the balcony on Hamilton Avenue, we'd get cell phones. Expensive then, right? We'd call the studio and they'd patch us in. And we used to broadcast from, from Lunken Playfield. Oh, it was quite dramatic for those days, yeah. The gay radio show was actually the work of John Zay. He was somehow responsible for the starting of the gay show in Philadelphia on WXPN, which still exists, and I think the show is still on. How that caused, and others will know this, maybe Scott Knox, how that caused John to start, Gay Dreams is what it was called. That was one of the names. And John sort of was a little edgy, of course. Anybody doing those things in those days would be. But when I first started out in '78, I used to see John Zay at all these events with his little microphone and tape recorder. And yeah, he was crazy, but weren't we all? And he made the mistake of airing an episode of what was called Greasy Fingers, as I remember. All it was about sexual lubricants. But somebody at Mount Washington had a child, and they made a big deal with WAIF and the FCC, and oh my God, there were charges, made against John and all this crap, and then it really hurt the show. And I'm not saying John did anything wrong. It was the times and all of that. And you talk about the atmosphere in Cincinnati. So eventually, the show suffered and they got rid of John, basically, even though I think he won his appeal and all that. By then, the damage was done. And it was then...
What year was this?
Well, I think the show started in '78 or thereabouts. I could be wrong. I think the station started in '76, December 1st of '76, just before I got here. So it was shortly thereafter. WAIF, it's still on the air with no gay programming. And, whatever happened to gay radio shows or lesbian radio shows here? Whatever happened to gay energy cable shows and stuff? I don't understand. Is there no need for it? Is it because the stuff is nationally syndicated now? There are gay shows, I don't know. It's so addressed in the modern media, but there doesn't seem to be there's not even really any printed local stuff. I mean, I don't consider something published out of Cleveland pretending to cover the whole state of Ohio, serious journalism. I mean, it's not local. It's kind of lip service here and there. It's like society events, that's how gay papers are now. So-and-so's having a fundraiser. You don't see any didactic, any analysis of anything, God forbid. I had the nerve when I was doing alternating currents. There was a person well placed in the gay community, name doesn't need to be said, it's in the past, but they had run afoul of the law. And then they were elected to the board of PFLAG, and I editorialized against it. Oh my God, was I hated. Oh my God, because I thought it was fundamentally not the right thing for that organization to do. You don't hear any type of analysis about, our organizations now. It's just you either take it or you leave it. Here it is, Nah. It's probably why I'm not so much a joiner anymore. I'm tired of it. Okay, the radio show, the radio show in Cincinnati, starting with John Zay in '78, I believe, or thereabouts, until he got in trouble with it. And then even though he was cleared, I think eventually he just gave up on it. I know that the group I was with that came in '86, which would be 6 years after, oh God, about 6 years afterwards, I know that Pat North, who was the treasurer of the coalition for years, was running the show, and she finally decided to give it up. And the coalition, that's how I found out about the opening. And I'll tell you something, Pat made the announcement at the coalition, and a friend of mine, Michael Lloyd, said, "Oh, I'd like to do that show." And I was smart enough to realize even then I had shot off my mouth too much. I'd never be allowed. So I said to Mike, "Why don't you do it?" He needed help, so I knew he'd be more acceptable. So Michael got in and did his thing, and then I joined Michael, which I remembered my friend Pat saying, "Oh, this will be interesting." And indeed it was for 10 years. Eventually I got run off that show 10 years later because one of my guests, we didn't have any tape delay. One of my guests went into an F frenzy. And I couldn't control him, so they just got rid of me and somebody else on the show. But it's fine, whatever. Those are just things that happen. You can't gag people, They didn't give us a tape to play delay to handle it, so oh well. And now, if you listen to the language on radio, it's a nothing burger, but it's just hilarious. It was a big deal then. Yes, it was on WAIF, and it continued after I left. Cheryl took it over, and she held on to it for 10 or years or so, and what happened is WAIF was not a very strong organization. There were a lot of problems, and I know Cheryl had her fill with it, and problems internally or what they could do or say, and she had her fill. So Arts WAIF had started a low-power FM station in downtown Cincinnati, and it was like WVQC or some name like that. Well, first of all, the problem there, and I think that's when Ron was on it, it had such a bad signal, you couldn't hear it hardly up to Northside, number one. At least with WAIF, you could get it out to 275. And then the problem was Arts WAIF lost its funding or whatever, and the station folded. So that was the end of that, and no one ever tried to restart it. That was it. That was the end of gay radio programming. Now, the TV side of things, the cable side of things started in, 85, I think. Gay Cable Network was started by Roger Eikenberry and Mark Bailey. Both of them still alive, a couple. They were teamed up with Gay Cable Network out of New York, and the producer was Joe Maletta, and I think he has passed on now, as I remember, and hopefully I got his last name right. So they would use some New York City footage, and then Sybil Ophthalmalia Brunchen, John Burke is his boy name, would come from New York and do segments here in the local studio, kind of a character. There was a lot of, God forbid we talk about drag in this day and age, right? With all these anti-drag measures. Don't we be able to air the show now? Imagine that. But there was even the Adventures of Baby Jane. There were different things that Gay Cable Network did. Outfront was a little stuffier because I was involved in it. We did news. We introduced news and interviews. The original show was more soft touch, drag entertainment. But, hey, I was political, so whatever. But after that closed in 94, I think it was, that was the end of any cable, So it's just weird how there wasn't an impetus to do that. And how I got involved in all that, I'll never know. Yeah, crazy. It was on some public access channels on Gay Cable's just on Cincinnati side of then, I think it was I'm trying to think what it was called, Time Warner. Northern Kentucky didn't have gay programming until Outfront began, which was February of '89. And that was the first time both Cincinnati and Northern Kentucky had gay programming on some of the public access channels. Not all of them, but some of them. And, you're limited to odd hours or whenever. It would vary week by week, So Gay Cable Network, and then followed by, it folded, and then Outfront followed it. Well, actually, what happened is a coup. No. Gay Cable Network was, Mark and Roger started it with the cooperation of the New York City Gay Cable Network. And they ran it for about a year, and then Mike Lehman ran it. And towards the end of it, some of my friends and I got involved. I think there was a difference in my criticism of it was that it was mostly entertainment and mostly bar-oriented. And I felt that the community was more diverse than that. And so I was more news-oriented, more politically oriented, and I didn't feel that enough women or people of color were on. And so I tried to address that in my time. And then eventually, editing in those days was not as easy as it is now, because you use those machines and servos, and it's not like where you can do it, virtually now, see it and just pick your frame and pop it right in there. Yeah. I used to know how to do that kind of editing. So when it folded, everybody thought it was dead, and a couple of us from the old show got together and started Out Front. And so it was really from the ashes of Gay Cable Network, and Out Front ran actually longer than Gay Cable Network and actually expanded its coverage. But in the end, people wear out. What was it? It was on the air, 4 or 5 years, It was a good training ground for people too,
When did it end?
I believe it was 1994. Yep, 1994.
Yeah, thank you.
John Maddox can tell you about that because he was the last producer of Out Front. And he was one of the people. You know how I met John Maddox? I had heard that this guy was doing research at UC about gay people. So I invited him on Alternating Currents. And so, in the day when I was doing Alternating Currents, we all think we did the best job. Michael does too. It was almost like an old-fashioned Ruth Lyons show. We had 20 or 30 people in the studio. We'd hand the mic around, and it was like a public forum. And it was really very energetic. It was a free-for-all. It was like my mental thoughts, But there was all sorts of people in there, yep. Had a group of groupies, a studio audience, if you will. And it's ironic because WAIF was in the basement of the Alms Hotel then, which was the location of the old WKRC radio and then TV, So yeah, it's crazy, all the history there. Out Front is on videotape because I foresaw in my dotage that it would vanish as well. So I took those, I got, Vic Ramstedter's Relations worked for a media company, so I got an old 1/2-inch U-matic and transferred them to DVDs. Boy, that was a 102-hour process. Ugh. It wasn't probably my normal thing either, because as the archivist from CNN looked at the PNG stuff in that period of time, said, where are all the pictures? Where are all the pictures? I said, well, you got to understand, we had photography, but it wasn't like now with cell phones. Yeah. You had to make the effort to take a camera, develop the film, da-da-da-da-da. But it's different. And about being an archivist, I'll tell you where I think it comes. Why does Michael Chanak keep track of things other than being crazy? I'm from a Greek-American family, and what do Greeks do? They're storytellers. And who raised me? My maternal grandmother, Yaya. You know what I mean? My Yaya. They recite the history. You got to know your history. You got to know your roots. Got to know where you come from. So I know some of my family history right back to the old world. So I think that's where it comes from.
Cool.
Yeah. It comes from it naturally, genetics. Yes. Yeah, those were things that Steve Busher did. Steve Busher passed on about 2 years ago. He was the graphics person for the old Gay Cable Network. He was a graphics artist. He ran B Graphics, and he would do the, in those days you had to do keying and all that kind of fancy stuff. And he did the graphics for Gay Cable, and then he eventually moved down to Florida, but he ran a website called, I think it was called the Rainbow Page, gaycincinnati.com. It's defunct now. There's a remnants of the Facebook page, but he did a lot of that graphical stuff. Of course, Steve's passed on now, but yeah. Oh boy, my participation in Pride goes back to as far as being on committees and doing something for Pride to 86. I was actively involved through 2016. It's a long time. And as I mentioned, I went to my first one in 85, kind of snuck it in the backside, but outed myself in full living color for Proctor Gamble in 86. So how has Pride changed in all these years? Well, first off, folks got to remember that I think I was a speaker on Fountain Square in 1987. There were like 200 people there. This was more of a meeting of the converted. It wasn't a lot of people talk about it, but they did not go out of fear, basically. And, you had the religious right there, thumping their Bibles. But it was sort of edgy, and I kind of miss that sometimes. It was sort of like you felt very alive going into that kind of thing. How safe it was, I don't know, but we did it. Glad I did. Of course, we added cars. Pride stopped about 95 and we jumped to 2000. We added cars in 2000. So as things came along, the quality of it changed. I think it was fun downtown, but things had dwindled down because of the passage of Issue 3 in 93, and by 95, that ended Pride parades until 2000. And so when we started up in 2000, we were in Northside. And that was like a homecoming. People were used to Northside. They felt more comfortable. Attendance jumped from, I would say it was like the last Pride in downtown in 2005 was maybe 1,100. And over those intervening years until we had the next parade, it was up to like 2,500. And by the time we left Northside in 2009, it was over 25,000. And that's really the reason. I know there's people say, oh, I miss Pride in Northside. Well, Northside's a great place, but it was too small. There wasn't a venue afterwards. We had a rally in Burnett Woods. We marched down, Ludlow to Hamilton. But where are you going to go to? As Hoffner Park, it's no way can hold what Sawyer Point does. So it was more personal in the past. It was easier to know people. I know some of us older sometimes whine, well, I don't know anybody, or, it's nice to see so-and-so, but, there's all these people and their kids, and it's different. It's a measure of our success that you see people there with their kids and families and all of that. So pride changes, life changes, get over it. That's my attitude about it. Doesn't bother me. Yeah, boy, does pride currently represent the concept of pride, and does it really represent the community? That's kind of a maybe and kind of, and depends on your perspective kind of answer, not to be too nuanced or coy. Let's say this, the things I miss about pride, I think that it should do, we've got plenty of drag shows and plenty of entertainment in the community. I'm fine with it. Of course, we need to celebrate. It's important to celebrate. It would be nice to see maybe a little bit of a return to, we used to have a rally where we had political speakers, and they were very popular. I know it wasn't for everybody, but, I think it could still be accommodated in a way, we can endorse points of view, but not politicians. And there's a difference, and I think we know what those differences are. And a lot of the rally functioned as a place for people to stage for the parade. I mean, I granted the geography's a little different, but people would get ready and kind of socialize, and there'd be speakers, and it was a good way to start the parade in the day. So I do miss that, and I think because it's gotten so big, it's gotten a tad impersonal, to say the least. And at my age, it can be a little overwhelming because, things break on you, and it's not the most comfortable. You have to have a certain amount of energy to navigate that. So I don't. We usually just find a space and across the street and pay our big money to park and walk into the edge and say, here I sit. I'll greet people here. And so that's kind of what some of us do. What would be nice, other than adding the politic of it, or at least where we are, is I've always been an advocate of a community picnic. I would love to see something organic as well, maybe in the fall of the year, just so that people, Pride's like a fever. It's like a beat of a drum, and people get all hyped up, and it's important. But it would be nice to create another larger scale event where people could maybe get together without all of that, the vendors and the shows and all that. Not everything has to be entertainment. It could just be like it used to be, those old church socials, people just got together and talked. I think we miss some of that sometimes. We're talking at each other, it feels like a lot of times. I mean, I'm glad to see that the Black group's involved and the Jewish group's involved and all that. Those are steps forward. But it would be nice to see more connection. It's hard to engineer that, though. People have to feel it, and I'm of a generation that we value it because that's how we came up. So I don't know how younger people feel, if they feel that need, but I sense there's loneliness. I sense there's a need for connection. Maybe it's changed a little bit. So I can't say post-marriage equality, do I really think Pride changed that much other than getting bigger? I can't say that I noticed anything. Now, at the same time, I was getting older, so I don't go through the whole thing anymore. I used to be always in the parade and that. You do see, couples and things. I don't know that it's intrinsically different. I'm not aware that there is. No, can't say that I've noticed anything. The HIV pandemic in Cincinnati, I became aware of it. What was it, in '82? I think is when the first cases are reported out of the coastal cities. And of course, Cincinnati being so hush-hush, there was a lot of whispering. And I'm going to use the old-fashioned pejorative term, gays would talk to one another, the boys, oh, well, so-and-so's bit, and all that kind of stuff, meaning they had the, quote, plague, And then you started seeing people in public with the folliculitis and the types of skin manifestations of HIV or... So it was definitely a thing. Now I think we should be grateful that we had people like Ron Rucker, who unfortunately passed on. He's the guy that worked for the health department that orchestrated the first anonymous test site in the world for HIV was right here in Cincinnati, thanks to Ron Rucker. And, that's quite a thing. And so, of course, we had originally, even before Caracol, there was, and even before there was, there was Stop AIDS, and prior to Stop AIDS, there was what? AIDS Volunteers of Cincinnati. I've lost track of this, but we had, I think, a pretty good response because AIDS Volunteers of Cincinnati ran programs. Even as a person that does not have HIV, to my knowledge, as I sit here, there were things where there were sessions where the men would get together and talk about issues of intimacy and stuff and sexuality. I think we miss those things now. There were also versions of Black and White Men Together that I participated in. I think it might have been called Brothers to Brothers. Maybe Ron remembers that, Ron Clemens. But those were very interesting, and they were also associated around HIV as well. I was one of those, sometimes the only white guy in the, face in the place, but, I enjoyed it. So I think, I never was a volunteer for Caracol or any of the AIDS agencies, but I had a lot of friends that were. How could you not get through that period of time and not know people? I'm sure I lost a couple of hundred people. I think the resiliency of our community came through in Pride. And looking back on it, I wonder how any of us living or dead made it, really. And then when you add in issue 3 in '93 and all the things, it really didn't start improving. Of course, HIV, finally they had drugs that were halfway effective in the early '90s, the cocktails. And of course, eventually with the passage of the turning away from issue 3 in 2004, Citizens to Restore Fairness. The late Gary Wright of Proctor Gamble led that effort. And things slowly began to improve then. And of course, we had a gay councilman and all that sort of thing. All those things are steps forward. We still have a gay councilman, so there you go. Maybe we'll have a lesbian, soon, and a transgender person soon. We should have already, right? Maybe we did. And I just don't know it. I think it was Pride. used to be a lot more activist-oriented, a lot more political. I think that's what drove the speakers. We knew we were in a struggle. We had the problems with the city. Now it's shifted so much to the celebratory side that I think, and some of it is, some of us have aged out, some of us have passed on. So there's not that institutional memory being passed along. That's very important. And when you consider how many people in my age band passed due to age, that's a big hunk of history, poof, gone. So you're not getting, so the younger people don't have as many people they can ask, and sometimes I get exhausted by it, having to explain what I can or I remember. There's only so much. I'm sure some others can relate to that, trying to capture the tone, the feel of it. And you don't want to do the past injustice. No, I don't think anybody does, let alone people that passed on of HIV, because it certainly wasn't so many people encountered not just a medical system that was full of bias and prejudice, but their families. This came at the worst time. I mean, the 70s began a resurgence, if you will, of gay pride and the village people, and we were going to, really go places. And just as things got a little better, boom, there was HIV. And that really had an effect. So, as for my participation in Pride or Pride in general, I've always been grateful to have been able to meet the numbers of people that I have met. Those who criticize me, those who praise me, because it's made me a better person. And I am glad that I lived in a place that had people so, motivated and so engaged. So go to Pride. I think in general, as I look at Cincinnati today, just my non-gay friends, the feelings about our community, 180 degrees. It really used to be friend of a friend and, friends of Dorothy and all that kind of stuff. But I'll tell you, one of the times when I was interviewed in the past couple of years on TV about some activity, maybe it's P&G or some diversity activity, I came home, and I live in a senior building, so it's older people. Yeah, it's pretty well mixed racially and all that sort of thing. Black woman walks up to me and she says, "Honey, I saw you on TV. Sister," she said, "Sister, you certainly had your say." And, it was just accepting, where that sort of thing, this is why you want to live in a city, right? Where you get that kind of, good for you, So that certainly was not the case. You were afraid because there was vandalism. If you were known, even when I had a boyfriend in the 80s, there were things that would happen, even going to some bars was problematic. I was actually chased in the late 70s in a 87 Dodge Omni through the streets of Clifton. I was with a friend, and all of a sudden these straight dudes from UC, or I guess hopped up or whatever, and they kept bumping the car. Well, it was a manual, and I know how to drive a manual. This queen, she ran some red lights and got away from them. Swear to God. It's crazy stuff. Old Mother Goose having to scamper for her life. How could Greater Cincinnati, and then maybe specifically the gay community, improve? Well, first of all, general, obviously the City Council recognizes we need housing, more housing, affordable housing, and better transportation. I'm not opposed to public transportation. We have a bus system and we have light rail downtown. But, if you talk to people, they say, the bus system is so slow. It takes me an hour from Clifton to get downtown. I'm not going to comment on it because I'm not a routine traveler on it, but it would be nice to see the town more accessible that way. I think that's a big issue for people to get around. Because I've had people say, Cincinnati is a very neighborhood-based place, and people say, "Oh, you live over there, or way up there." Well, come on. Like Mount Healthy, where I live, is 8 miles from downtown? This is not 100 miles. Come on, folks. It's that kind of thinking that makes me crazy. So housing and transportation, I would say, in general, I would see wanting to be improved. I'm no expert on any type of race relations or anything like that. In the gay community, I wish that there would be more alternative spaces, and not anything against the bars, but it does seem like there's a crying need for safe places just where people can hang. Maybe not with even huge programs. Just, where do you go really? There isn't really anything I can think of. You can go to meetings to get out of the house, but that's kind of a bore after a point. Meetings, you know what I mean? Where do you go other than a bar to socialize? So there's something missing there. I just haven't put my finger on it yet. That's why I'm an advocate of picnics. Good old picnic.